para tener una relación creo muy interesante porque nos habla de las relaciones entre la escritura y los lectores, entre esta relación íntima de los relatos o de Póricos a Santiago de Compostela. El profesor Greenia es profesor emérito de su universidad, es director de un importante centro de estudios norteamericanos, es una persona que conocemos muy bien porque viene frecuentemente a Santiago con sus alumnos, así que ha hecho también una obra de difusión del conocimiento de Santiago de Compostela. Y desde poco, en este momento quiero saludarlo también por esto, es miembro correspondiente del Comité Internacional de Expertos. Es una nueva figura que se ha creado desde poco tiempo y hay personas que representan al Comité de Expertos en los puntos más importantes del mundo. Uno de estos es el profesor Greenia.
Gracias a todos, especialmente por esta invitación a presenciar un congreso de tan alta calidad con otros ponentes que admiro tanto. Quiero comenzar diciendo primero que voy a dar la conferencia en inglés, en su mayor parte, necesariamente bilingüe en este caso, pero quiero comentar, o simplemente comenzar con estas palabras, that in these moments of disaster, international tension, and international tragedy, I'm especially happy to be here in Santiago and in Spain. The compassion, the conviction, the commitment of Spain to helping refugees from the Ukraine be received here in Spain with all charity and hospitality as any medieval pilgrim might be is truly impressive. And the other night I walked past the Parliament building here in Santiago, and I saw that they had changed the ground lighting to blue and yellow, the colors of the Ukraine flag. And let me just say on behalf of my country that we're very proud of our friendship with Spain. Thank you. This presentation will be very simple. I only have 2 points to make. One, that Christianity is a religion obsessed with literacy. And two, our relationship to the written word is changing. Our relationship to the written word is undergoing a transformation. And if we presume that our relationship to writing itself is the same as it has been in the past, we will misinterpret the Middle Ages. Normally, I start out my presentations with Americans by asking simple questions. Who has ever written a personal journal, a diary, with your memories and ended up publishing parts of it? I ask people, who has kept a personal diary and actually gone back to read it? And who has promised themselves to do journaling as a complement to their pilgrimage? These are actually questions that Americans especially are very much invested in. Now, I also want to project to you the idea of pilgrimage as a motor for memory. By the way, there's a handout that I provided. If anyone did not receive one, it's in Spanish. I'll be happy to email it to you and just send me your request. But with pilgrimage as a motor for memory, we want to study the history of the supports, the writing instruments, what you wrote on during the vast course of history. We're going to include, for our next presentation, Instagram, which is one of the ways of recording history. It represents the memory of the community because pilgrims frequently write to sustain the memory of a larger group. We want to know the different types of pilgrim writing, why they wrote for different purposes. And one of the hardest things to do is to know the lector implícito, Who is the implied reader for what is being produced? This changes over time. It changes by the genre of writing, and it changes by the author. And sometimes it shifts within the same work. And finally, writing as a therapeutic practice. This is very big nowadays, that you write, you keep a journal in order to improve yourself, to advance yourself, to heal yourself. It's self-assigned, it's self-monitored, it's free. How far back does it go? Professionally sponsored, endorsed therapeutic writing. 1966 is the earliest reference I can find in the professional literature. One of the ways of tracking the interest in pilgrimage over time is by doing word frequency analysis from databases. Excuse me. If we look at the word pilgrimage in English, we can see highs and lows. Can I suggest that there's a high early on that corresponds to the Romantic period? But then we see a low, which I barely have to mention to this audience, during the First World War and the Second World War, when discussion in English about pilgrimage bottomed out. If we look at peregrino in español, un término netamente en español, well, the frequencies change. You can see that in 1858, Lourdes, and then again in 1917 in Fatima, the mentions of pilgrimage, de peregrino en español, come to a peak. What's curious for us who study the Camino de Santiago is that during this period, when the relics are recovered, we don't get much recording in books and magazines and journals and newspapers, published material. The term peregrino does not become more frequent. But there is a high point after Fatima. And why? Again, to this audience, it's no surprise. It's the era of Franco, who we would say in English, weaponized pilgrimage to support the dictatorship and that regime. What's truly interesting for us as modern pilgrims is that we have rehabilitated St. James. He now has a cleaner profile, a more welcoming presence to a wider world. If we look at the different terminology in Spanish, en español, entre peregrinación, peregrino, peregrinaje, you can see that the first two terms sort of parallel each other, but peregrinaje is actually a new term. We are abstracting ourselves. We're considering pilgrimage as an abstraction, apart from actually doing it. And if we look at religious tourism in English, we can see an enormous spike just in the last few years. Why? Because interconfessional pilgrimage from Catholics, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, a whole range of various confessions and congregations, and the ease for the middle class in almost every country to go on pilgrimage and travel internationally. What are the numbers? How many people are going on pilgrimage? How many people are doing religious tourism? The numbers provided by the United Nations Office of Tourism Research suggest that now, every year, people who are traveling for religious tourism as a primary or secondary reason for travel are reaching between 300 and 400 million people per year. The volume of traffic is enormous. And I will just mention now that the prestige model that I keep on hearing about as I travel around the world, to Serbia, to Mexico, to Finland, is the Camino de Santiago, como el modelo de más prestigio. What can we say about pilgrimage as a definition? That it's to celebrate a place, that it is to take you out of your accustomed environment, that you're going to lend yourself to behaviors that are outside of your usual pattern. You will wait in line, you will keep silence, you will embrace the apostle, you will bless yourself, you will genuflect. You will do all sorts of things in this culture and in other cultures that are unaccustomed. But I want to do them. There are transcendent values that are sought, but there's also a transactional element. That is to say, I'm doing something important, and I'm hoping for something important in return. Be careful, because this becomes very dangerous in a spiritual way. If I do something big for God, God owes me big. That never works in any religion. And finally, from the get-go, from the outset, one sees pilgrimage as something that's going to produce permanent memories, fine memories, deep memories for the rest of your life. I got into this project, into this trajectory, some years ago when I was invited to participate in a research team out of the University of London. About 25 of us were working on, libros y lecturas de las rutas medievales a Roma y a Jerusalén. Well, of the 25, about 20 of them were working on Jerusalem. But plausibly enough, the number of witnesses that we have from the Middle Ages is certainly proportional. About 4 people were working on Rome. And they looked around and they found one person, as an afterthought, to talk about Santiago. I tried to be a good sport and do my best. But the real project was to think about 5 phases of writing. What were the books that inspired people to go on pilgrimage? What did they take with them? What did they look for in writing as they traveled? What did they copy to bring home? And what did they write after they returned? Which completes the circle. What they wrote after they returned often inspired other people to undertake pilgrimage. Well, it was an interesting project because we're looking at the libraries in the general sense of all the writing associated with pilgrimage. What are the texts that are preserved in the archives? What was the role of books and writing of all types before, during, and after pilgrimage? What can we say about the residue in archives? Be careful, there's a national prejudice about archives. And what's written by pilgrims is written mostly by foreigners. If you go to the museums, the Bibliothèque Nationale à Paris, what do you see preferentially? French texts. If you go to London, English texts. If you go to the Biblioteca Nacional in Madrid, you see Spanish texts. Pilgrimage texts are usually written by outsiders and are not presented in the same way. Was there a pilgrim culture that crossed frontiers? There was, but it was fleeting. It was vanishing. People from outside who were visiting. And so the archives don't favor them. When did pilgrims read? And when did they write? And how could they write? Can we tell the difference in what's written between pilgrimages that people actually took and pilgrimages that were just imagined? What types of evidence? We're looking at itineraries, including liturgical itineraries. We're looking at ex libris to track who owned books and where. We're looking at travel guides, descriptions of places that people visited. Here we go. Inventories, catalogs of medieval libraries and private collections. Testamentary bequests. People left travel narratives of pilgrimage as a dynastic treasure of a family. We're looking for indulgences and notes taken along the way. We're looking for paratextual indications of what was written. Emblemas, recuerdos de santuarios. The codicological format of the book, the physical book, is important. Whether it's meant to be taught, it may be in its own pocket, built that way for travel. And iconography written into books, like a cross representing Jerusalem. Here we go. This is an interesting book. It's a book of hours in which they have carefully included pilgrim badges, medals, gotten from various shrines. It does not mean that the person who owned the book necessarily visited all these places. They may simply be a collection. And if you can't visit all these places, well, there's other ways to include your repertoire. Well, you can have them painted into a book representing all the places you will visit spiritually. So what did they ask me to find for Spain, the rest of the people studying Jerusalem and Rome? Well, they wanted to know, what do we know about books and readers for the Camino de Santiago in the medieval and early modern period? Could people buy books when they came to Santiago? What kind of books? What was the role of institutional libraries? Like here at San Martín Pinario, did they maintain a library, a reference library for pilgrims? What was the book market like? What were people buying and what were they looking for when they got to Santiago? Se me acaba este aparato. And when, if it ever existed, did you have a pilgrimage to Santiago as a mental alternative instead of going in your own self? To what point is doing the Camino a physical exercise versus an imagined reality? The various members of our research team did wonderful projects, including one of my colleagues from Fordham University who studied Crusader Acre. Pilgrims going to Acre collected indulgences by visiting various churches. But what's interesting is that they could not write their presence in that church themselves. They had to go to a public notary, notario público, to have a comprobación, proof that they had visited that. Those give us a sequence of writing facilities where you could apply to a legitimate writer with his own seal to prove that you had visited this place and gained a certain number of indulgences. It's one of the touch points between literacy and pilgrimage. Marcus Stitch, with gratitude to our German colleagues here, a graduate student, wrote a dissertation, now defended, on the shopping list for pilgrims leaving from Venice. What do you buy before you board the ship to go to the Holy Land? Well, you buy bowls, candles, orinales. You're going to be on the ship for a long time. Hard cheese, not soft cheese, hard cheese that will last. Some sort of chest, a live chicken. It's a very good thing to travel with. It produces eggs. It eats almost anything. And when it stops giving eggs, you can eat the chicken. The eggs are also a good trade item for small purchases along the way. The cage for the chicken, sweets, because they preserve well. And so a number of items that you might need for your pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Because he's German, Marcus did a wonderful job of organizing all the things that were mentioned on various medieval shopping lists, including the chicken and the chicken cage and the chicken food. Actually, there are 222 items mentioned in these lists that one might purchase for your trip to Jerusalem. And gosh, because he's German, he's very organized, and he did a fine distribution with mathematical proofs of the different frequency of different items. And because he's German, he did a very good analysis of mathematical correspondences, which you can see right in the graph, that there are here and here. And God bless him, because Marcus is German. He did a very good job, an admirable job. And you can see the mathematical correspondences and convergences here and here. So thank you, Marcus. But it's a valuable study to know what people were writing as essential shopping lists before going on pilgrimage. My friend at St. Andrews University did a thing called dirty books. That's to say, no libros de color subido, sino dirty books in that they're smudged. They've gotten dirty from use, and you can tell how often they're opened at a certain page by the dirt deposited and oil from the hands of the user. It's brilliant stuff, actually, and now she has invented, with a large grant, a small vacuum cleaner, aspiradora, to pick up pollen. This will tell us if the book has traveled, because if it has pollen from foreign locations, we can tell, this book has been to France, to England, to the Netherlands, because of the pollen deposited on the pages. But the work that I want to tell you about, most importantly today, is one of the treasures of the Cathedral Museum in Lugo. It's absolutely beautiful now. It's on the tribune level. It's clean. It's well illuminated. And their greatest treasure, frankly, is the Crismón de Quiroga. Fortunately, we have one of the great experts on the Crismón de Quiroga here, José Suárez Otero, who can answer more questions at the end. But this is an extremely valuable artifact. It's the first archaeological proof or witness that we have to the Christianization of Galicia. It's late 5th, early 6th century perhaps, and it is marvelous. The trouble is, inclined like that to present to the museum viewer is wrong. And I'll tell you why in a second. A replica was made to present to the original parish that owned this beautiful marble device, and it was installed in the front of the altar, totally vertical like this. That presentation is wrong, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Here's the replica. I want you to focus on the Crismón, the Quiro in the middle, with the alpha and the omega, but especially on the double ring of beads or perlas and the writing between them. Those are going to be crucial for understanding how this object worked, because it was a working object and not just a display piece. Here it is. What's the inscription around the outer band? Aurum vile tibi est, argente pondera, quedan plus est quod propria felicitates nites. Well, el oro es cosa vil para ti. No digamos ya la plata. Es mucho más lo que brillas por tu propia felicidad. And in English, for you, gold is vile, so let's not even mention silver. You shine far brighter with your own happiness. It's not scriptural, and it doesn't come from the fathers of the church either. As a matter of fact, if you look at the Latin, it's metrical, it's grammatically correct, but it's odd. It's strange Latin. Why? It's stunt Latin. It's Latin that provides every letter of the Latin alphabet. This is a divination table. It would have to be fully horizontal, so you could take a little clay or wooden ball and roll it between the outer beads or pearls or dots, and every time it stopped on a letter, a literate temple functionary would write down the letter, and if you did it enough times, you could recover a prophecy, an oracle, a revelation, a message from God. Now in the Christian tradition, this is heretical. It's bibliomancy, condemned by Thomas Aquinas in the mid-13th century. But it's a perfect continuation of Roman customs. That is to say, Roman customs of superstition, of trying to extract prophecies, oracles, were extremely common. This is a transitional piece. It's finely manufactured. The marble is from Quiroga, from the quarries there. It's local manufacture, but it shows a tradition from Roman practices of religion to Christian. So this Crismón de Quiroga, how do we know it was never upright or tilted? Well, there's no signs of any metal supports of any way. The bottom side is completely flat. I looked at it last summer, examining as much as I could, just visually. Yes, that's me, I'm sorry. There's very little scraping on the surface. This was also a table for donations. That's to say, people would put an offering on top of this table in exchange for getting a divination, for getting some sort of answer. And what answers were they looking for? Will the crops fail? Will the rain come? Will there be war? Will there be peace? Can I have a child? If you look carefully at the outer edges, you can see that some of those beads have been removed. Why? They have not been knocked off. They were surgically removed by pilgrims, people who came to this site on pilgrimage to get an answer. Those beads were removed, taken home, ground up, consumed in the hopes of producing the pregnancy that was hoped for. Once you invent printing, the relationship to mass-produced text changes. We have an interesting quotation from Felix Fabri talking about shields, about escudos. Felix Fabri's principal responsibility had been to shepherd a party of German knights. This was no easy task. Large, testy men, used to carrying heavy metal, they did not take kindly to being teased by Arab street urchins. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they sat around talking knight talk about princes and quarrels, about the campaigns they had served. Worse still, they went up to the chapel of Mount Calvary and bowed themselves down upon the holy rock. They would pretend to be praying, and when the circle of their arms, they would secretly scratch on the rock their shields, los escudos. Nowadays, well, people would take selfies. They went on to do the same in the monastery of St. Catherine at Sinai, as we heard earlier, so that the warm stone vaults of the monks' refectory are now covered with florid heraldic shields, as if it were southern German Rathskeller. This is precisely what we heard in the first session, beautifully. Of course, gracias. Of course, modern pilgrims would never do that. And I'm sure these are all from Americans. What can I say? Jesus didn't start in Sarria. That's right, he started in San Jean. Peregrinos, turistas. That's right. Pretty sure Jesus never walked the Camino. So, what can we say about this? Pilgrims were preoccupied with, first of all, useful things, weights and measures, distances, weather, seasons, money equivalencies, cures and therapies that people found along the way. There's personal documentation, like the safe conducts, letters that you carried for people or back to people. There are even letters, if you died along the way, that your companions would take home to your family with your last will and testament. And documents to show charges for your patron underwriting the trip, for your town, for whomever. But lots of pilgrims did not write anything. There have plenty of romances, songs to sing, stories to tell, jokes, pilgrim jokes are still over. Chismes. This is things that you knew by heart, oraciones, hymns that you learned by heart, epics, for heaven's sake, hagiografía, historias de milagros, cartografía. These are all part of what you get orally. And with more time, we would talk about Ethiopian manuscripts because they became objects that went on pilgrimage. They're carried by priests. They're written in Ge'ez, the liturgical language of Ethiopia, and they're carried to provide an object of pilgrimage out to people who can't travel. The monks carried them as objects of pilgrimage for others to venerate. And the images produce what they depict. The veneration of writing itself is also here in Santiago. The cruces de consagración, which are the most splendid of all Christendom. I've looked at them in Rome and throughout Europe and the United States, and we have in Santiago the most beautiful of all and the most dateable of all. And people use them as stations, not stations of the cross, but where you would stop and pray. Even if you don't read what's written on them, you stop and pray. In 1519, in 1594, and apparently in 1610 as well. We have at least 3 witnesses that apparently those stations are actually the crosses, whether they're read or not, but you're venerating writing itself. And pilgrims still do it today, leaving tokens, messages, statements, petitions before the tomb of St. James. Our conclusions are that the greater the distance, the more likely a written account of pilgrimage. Perhaps people who knew how to read and write did not, as part of their disciplines of a penitential pilgrimage, not allowing themselves to write for a certain period of time. It's still hard to tell who the implied reader is, and the memories of sacred travelers could be a way to augment, to promote, to certify another identity. I'm not just a merchant. I'm not just a curious traveler. I want to be a pilgrim too. But finding your own identity, healing yourself, I don't think it's part of the medieval mindset. And the very first witnesses I've been able to find, Kip Reddick says it's a self-awarded trophy in some ways. So many men, especially, arrive in Santiago and say, voy a escribir todo un libro sobre mi camino. El orgullo es obvio. Casi una obsesión. But actually, we have San Ignacio de Loyola, who talked about treasuring what he wrote, which brings him consolation. And a much richer source, I believe, will be Santa Teresa de Jesus. One can write on a journal, and you're really writing for your future self, for your ideal self, maybe for your best self. That's a reason to write. There's a sense of narrative circumference. People who are writing because they want to be written into God's history. And there are other people who write because they're going to let God into my history. There's a difference there. And finally, our relationship to writing itself has changed. Who can read script anymore? Normal cursive. It's becoming a forgotten art. And our relationship to handwriting, to writing, and to reading has changed. I think all of these considerations are important to understand the narratives of medieval pilgrims as well as modern. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos mucho al profesor Greenia esta brillante exposición, tan documentada, con tantos elementos, que nos hace reflexionar entre las relaciones entre el escritor, el que lee, el que camina, el que no habla, el que no cuenta, el que no sabe escribir. Es un mundo inmenso y sobre todo nos hace reflexionar sobre la memoria del peregrino. La memoria de la peregrinación es fundamental. Toda la peregrinación es memoria en cualquier momento, incluso en la época actual.